Welcome to the HR Huddle podcast, presented by Sapient Insights Group, the ultimate resource for all things HR. It's time to get in the huddle.
Welcome to Spilling the Tea on HR Tech, where we focus on the hottest HR tech news everyone needs to know to be in the know. We break down the news of the week and help you make sense of what it means for our industry and how it can impact your organization. I'm Stacey Harris, your host, Chief Research Officer and Managing Partner for Sapient Insights Group. And joining me today for the conversation is our co-host, Cliff Stevenson, Director of Research and Principal Analyst here at Sapient Insights Group. Welcome back to the show again, Cliff.
Thank you, Stacey. Excited to be here.
Yeah, it's a busy couple of weeks. I know we took almost an hour kind of pre-prepping for this call or this conversation today because of the fact that there were so many different topics that we had to sort of dive into. We were trying to figure out how are we going to have the conversation that was going to get the most information across. We've got really 6, I think, topics that we're going to be talking about today because, again, very busy week. We're definitely going to start off, although as you and I talked about, this will be when everyone sort of listens to it next week. It'll be the week past it, but the International Women's Day and some really interesting news coming out about sort of how that's happening and the big theme around women in technology. We're also going to spend some time today talking about what's happening both in some of the larger firms and smaller firms from a tech perspective. There's some news on Workday and some recent lawsuits there. We're going to give a little bit of update on that and how that's going to impact the market. Some news from Hierology, some partnerships they're building, as well as some interesting news from our friends over at the SAP SuccessFactors area around some of their new technology when it comes to databases and data management. And then if we get a little bit of time today, we really want to try and get to also some interesting conversations about artificial intelligence and what we are starting to see some companies doing in that space around training and development, as well as newer recruiting tools and how those are being managed. And ultimately, we've got a little bit of information, I think, as we wrap up, if we get some time on where the EEOC is taking some of these conversations. So, Cliff, a big day, lots of different conversations to have. Why don't you go ahead and start us off with the first topic, International Women's Day?
That's right. So speaking of, although I don't know whether Forbes meant to do this, it's very on topic, especially with the theme of this year's International Women's Day, which has to do with the intersection of technology and women's rights and how technology can aid in empowering women, especially in the workplace. And so this article, Technology is Equalizer, Solutions that Open Management Doors to Women and Minorities, on Forbes, March 6th, talks about, at the beginning, it's a lot of it's a sort of a primer to people that may be unfamiliar with HR tech and how that works. But some of the things that I found very interesting is the discussions about talent marketplaces, where they talk about how having a area where people can see the skills and the projects and all of those sort of things amongst their employees and giving that visibility to women in the workplace, how that can really assist. And then also things like career planning that employees themselves can use to visualize where they want to go. They can see what is required to get ahead rather than sort of feeling like that isn't something they could do. So I found both of those sort of very interesting, especially in relation to the day that it is today.
Yeah, it's always a challenging conversation, right? Between sort of elevating the great works that women in our industry and in our market and across the globe have done, and also ensuring that the women sort of who are coming into the workforce feel like they can have the same level of impact. And, I always say this, it's really hard to be the first in anything, but you also get so much more attention for being the first in anything. So the first woman to go to space, the first woman to be a scientist, right? It's really hard to be the second and third and fourth because you have to work oftentimes just as hard, but you don't get the same accolades, right? And that goes for anything, and it's not just women, it's all kinds of things that we're dealing with in our sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations that we're having in the market. But what I think was really interesting when I was sort of looking at this theme, say, of digital, it's kind of, if you haven't gotten looked at the theme, you really got to go look at it. Innovation and technology for gender equality. is the idea, yes, we've got to create more opportunities in STEM. Yes, we've got to create more opportunities with data and science and for women, and making sure that they're really being viewed as equal partners in all of those areas. But I also think we have to understand that there's not just a business value, but a real need to have the differing perspectives in our technology, right? Like, it's not just, oh, we need to create space. It's, oh, our technology will be different if it's created by more diverse groups of people, right? It just will be. And I think that's the piece that we oftentimes forget in these conversations. And it's one of those areas, I think, where we as industry analysts oftentimes have to really keep honing in on, is that it's not about just creating space. It's about the outcome that you're going to achieve through that work and through having diverse audiences and through having diverse workers. Because in many cases, it's hard. It's really hard to merge people of different backgrounds, different cultures, different experiences into teams who are trying to move fast for creating technology or developing new medicines or vaccines. But you get such a different product, and so much better product when you do it right, right? The one thing I do want to add to that conversation, and this year was one of the, we've done it for a couple of years, but this year is one of the first years we started to publish, because I always like to get a couple of years of data before I start publishing data in the annual HR system survey. We published some more demographics about the professionals who participate in our research, which are generally those people who are at the center or in the crossroads of HR technology management and HR technology buying decisions. And what we found is that it was nice to see, and it had definitely increased over the last several years, that women were at least 70% of our respondents, which makes sense. Women are definitely have a higher percentage overall in the HR audience. But as you went up in level, you did see it sort of average out. As we went up to senior directors, C-suite executives, it was a 50-50 split in our data. Now, that is not the case in the market as a whole, but in our data, that was nice to see. Where it really got a little different was in ownerships. We have lots of CEOs who take our survey as well, especially for mid-market and small businesses. And we saw about 67% of the owners were men, and less than 50% were women. And then there was like a 1% that was sort of non-binary as identified. And I just thought that was a hard thing to have a conversation about, because I do think there are certain places where things plateau when we're talking about these conversations. And that's part of what we have to, I think, take ownership in both our industry and across the board. I don't know, Steve, Cliff, does any of that make any sense to you?
It does. That conversation? Absolutely. And they lightly touched on the sort of visibility and the sort of pathing of how to get there. But one of the things you touched on is in the development of the technology, right? When we're talking about that as analysts, but also, as buyers, think about when a technology is made to do something, right? It's made to overcome bias. Who are the people that made that technology, right? It's worth asking those questions. How is that developed? There's an ongoing joke that you see these panels about how to increase diversity, and it's all white men. So it's the same idea. In order to truly understand the audience, we need to develop completely in the same way with diversity all the way from the start. And I love that idea. And I feel like I'll go ahead and mention it, because I feel like you're not going to, that Sapient Insights Group is a completely women-owned and ran business. I'm very proud of that.
Thank you. Yes, we are. We've got our certifications, and it was definitely one of the conversations when Susan, Terry, and I started working together. Was we really are proud of being a women-owned business, and we just think it gives us a different perspective sometimes on sort of what we're looking at and how we're thinking about the market. But again, it's, I really like to think, what is the outcome you're trying to achieve? So how are you going to build a more diverse environment is part of what you want to see. So I love that conversation. And it does kind of lead to this next topic, which we were going to be talking about, which is sort of software that is sort of helping making decisions on a recruiting and training perspective. I think it's probably important to note that we're going to be talking a little bit about a lawsuit that is still in the makings with Workday. Workday recently has if you sort of look at what's happening in the market, they basically had a lawsuit brought against them for their artificial intelligence systems for their screening tools. And it was allegedly that it is disqualifying applicants who are Black, disabled, or over the age of 40 at a disproportionate rate, according to the lawsuit. Now, looking at all the data and everything, this is still in the very early stages. And Workday is basically saying they feel that this is an unfounded lawsuit. The lawsuit is focusing on 80 to 100 different applications that were entered by one person who's bringing the lawsuit against the organization. I would recommend you go out and read it on your own so you get all the details and the facts. But here's my take on this. Mm-hmm. We know from just being research and industry analysts that Workday has been one of the most conservative, and in some cases, the most sort of careful, I would say, in how they're approaching artificial intelligence across their platform. That's not to say that any application can't fall into sort of these challenges, because we know artificial intelligence in and of itself has challenges because as a whole, it's being designed by historical data and training data that is across the workforce and the historical workforce in the market. And that gives you some challenges no matter what system is using the artificial intelligence databases. But what we do know is that, at least from my concern around this, is that we know these lawsuits need to be brought so that things are brought to light about what's happening. And depending on how these lawsuits are brought forward, they'll set precedent for where the market's going to head as far as who has more rights and more balance in sort of what they're able to do in the market. And we'll see where this one particularly ends up. But I think what you're going to find is that if it ends up in favor of any one of the parties, it will be setting precedents for future litigation that could be happening. Cliff, I know you had a lot of conversations with organizations around artificial intelligence and how they're using it from a screening perspective. This is like we see a lot of organizations who are trying to figure this out right now and do it in an ethical fashion, but it's a hard thing to do.
It is. And as you sort of mentioned, that a lot of that's going to come down to how these lawsuits and various sort of legislative things come down. And my worry is that we may be sort of throwing out the baby with the bathwater, in that we've just talked about how technology can serve a positive purpose. And we don't want to fall into the trap of thinking that because of sort of few bad apples have, gone in and spoiled the bunch. Because yes, there are ethical and unethical uses of these technologies. And there have been companies, as you mentioned, who have been a little more blasé and a little more maybe laissez-faire about how they go out and use this technology. And I'm sure it's been a repeated refrain that we've gone over many times, but technology alone can't sort of solve these problems. But by the usage of these technology, you can overcome issues that cannot be done simply on your own, right? Sometimes you need ways to make things anonymous, to increase visibility, to sort of create an even objective playing field. But it is definitely a lawsuit very much worth watching, and I think ties into something else that we saw, if you don't mind me mentioning that, which was directly from the EEOC, because they had put out just recently some new sort of, at least a draft on guidelines for increased scrutiny of AI tools, especially in hiring and recruitment, to make sure that the use is non-discriminatory. So, this just really ties into it, that apparently the spotlight, the magnifying glass has turned towards these tools and how they're used. And I think it's going to require some very careful understanding of the context to really get us to a better place. Because, of course, we don't want discrimination. But one of the ways actually we combat that is through our technology.
It's one of the ways we combat it, but I also think it is important that these kind of conversations have to take place.
Yes.
Even if we are as careful as we can possibly be, we have to bring these conversations to light. I just hope that the lawsuits are handled with the idea towards where we're heading in the future. And I think that's going to be really up to the judges who are managing them, to the lawyers who are involved in them. And that I would definitely catch up with people like Kate Bischoff, who I think understands this law and the HR space a lot better than most. or Heather Busing, who a good friend of ours, who also I think has a better take on sort of where this sits and how this sits into the market. But I just felt it was important to mention that, we've just got to, these cases are gonna come up, and I think they're gonna be important. But I also think that, to your point, we can't use them as an excuse not to move forward, right? That we've got to be leveraging technology. And I think just, as we talked about in the International Women's Day conversation, there's so many times when some of this kind of stuff sort of causes people to say, oh, I'm just not going to even try and use that technology in my company. And they end up putting their head in sand. And then there's other things that come out because of it, right?
Right. Yeah. It's not like we didn't have discrimination before the use of these tools. But yeah, like you said, it's worth continuing the conversation, making yourself aware of the nuances that are going on in these sort of things.
And maybe kind of on the other side of this, we had another story this week about Augmenteer. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly.
I'm not sure either.
Yeah. Do you maybe want to explain that? Because that's on kind of the training and skills management side of this, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is a company, Augmenteer, that has sort of expanded. Now, Augmenteer seems to mostly be used within the manufacturing industry, used for operations, especially frontline operations. And what they have done is really sort of combined their already existing AI and models that were used for employee communications and performance indicators with our old friends, ChatGPT, right? To allow sort of more natural language, conversations, chatbot capabilities that will be coming to Augmenteer customers. And, it's another one that we're seeing where I worry. And again, it's a limited amount of information that we know, but I worry when it's only thought of, these technologies are only thought of as ways to increase productivity without thinking about the other ways that it can affect humans in the workplace.
That's, and ChatGPT we just talked about last week. So if you want to hear more about it, we give some commentary on it last week. And I think quite a few good articles have been put out on LinkedIn about it over the last couple of weeks. But yes, I do think that it's, in this particular case, there's this concern that it is, we could end up in some of the same boats here, even though it's not about recruiting, which is a really, really, you have to carefully manage that. I can understand the frustration of the gentleman in the lawsuit who's just, recruiting is such an important component of being able to move into the work environments that we want to create more diverse workforces with, right? But training is just as important. If you don't get training inside organizations, you don't get development, or you don't get the right training and development, right? You end up with similar situations where people feel like they are not only being given equal opportunity, but they're also not being given the development they need to grow inside the organization, right?
Yeah, I think especially true in those manufacturing environments, which I think don't sometimes get enough, press or enough thought, because we tend to focus a little more on quote unquote, the kind of the white collar workers. But these tools can be very valuable even on manufacturing floors. And again, it's just all in how they're used and deployed.
Yeah. So it's space to watch, right? We're there's so much going on in the space. I think it's important to just ensure that, you're thoughtfully managing all of this inside of your organization. Well, sort of moving on from sort of these really big and important conversations that we're having about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, and how organizations are managing data and how organizations are addressing both the personal needs, the professional needs, and the human needs of every individual. We also are starting to really look at how we're seeing data connected and flow. And one of the big, I think, conversations happening around that is data management, because there is a big conversation about what can I and can't I do with my employee data that has another ethical component to it inside of organizations. And SAP just introduced what they're calling the SAP Datasphere to simplify customers' data landscapes, along with partnering with a lot of other data management and governance tools like Calibra and Confluent and Databricks and DataRobo. If you want to talk a little bit about this, because this is one we talked a lot about, and we were just trying to go through our mind, like, what exactly is it? And I think we came along lines, it's a management tool, right?
Yeah, that's right. It seems to be almost the next generation, or at least the next step in a centralized data, going beyond a data warehouse and a lake to give real-time data that has also an automated data governance tool, right? So your safety, security, your access, but also your data definitions, and the data is streaming. That's all of those companies that Stacey mentioned. They're sort of all specialists in these areas. So the end result, though, for the end user will be that you are able to sort of have your external data. If you have a ecosystem of a lot of different HR tech or even tech from different operational areas, all of that data will be in one hub, hopefully, right? That you can go in and gain your insights from there and know that that is the capital T truth. That is what they're going for. Now, again, this is brand new. This literally sort of pinged onto Stacey and I's, email just an hour or so ago. So we're this is the hottest of the hot tea. But it looks like the evolution of what we're doing with people data management.
Yeah, and we'll get more detail about this, I think, over the next week. They're doing a briefing for analysts. So we don't want to, until we kind of get a chance to see what all the ins and outs of it is, we don't want to sort of say exactly what we think it is, because, a lot of these press releases have a lot of marketing language that could be interpreted in a lot of different ways. But because a lot of things you just mentioned are some of the things those partners do, right? So it was that's what we were trying to figure out was, is it doing all this? Is it just doing some similar things? Is it taking the data and aggregating it? We'll find out more over the next couple of weeks. But I do think that we're going to see, if you think about how the last couple of years have gone, we've kind of had the HRS wars, the ERP wars, like who's going to be my primary and all those. The next conversation, if it already isn't happening, to be honest, in bigger companies, it really is already happening, is the data wars. Who's going to have the primary location, the primary sort of data warehouse management model, whatever you want to call it, data lake model that we're going to use inside of our organization. And it's not going to be just between Oracle, SAP, Workdays, those guys, right? It's going to be also including Amazon and, Microsoft and all of those organizations as well. And so I think, and then even companies above those that are even bigger, we're seeing, the IBMs and them get into this game as well. So it is, I think the big conversation comes down to every company, if they don't already have one, not only should they have an enterprise data management model, if you're in the HR space, you should definitely have an employee data management model that fits as part of that. And one of the things that we saw this year, since 2020, we saw about a 60% increase in the percentage of organizations who at least had an enterprise data management model, but we're still, I think, only at about 30% of organizations. It originally started out at like 16%, which blew my mind that prior to COVID and 2020, only 16% of organizations had an enterprise wide employee data management model, which means they knew all the data they were gathering about the employees and at least where it all sat. Now today we're at somewhere in the range of 30% or so. But I just think that, that's still way too low for what I think the need is going to be in the market, right?
Absolutely. I mean, especially when we talk about the really strong push towards a strategic HR function, it's hard to do that sort of planning without objective data. We're all moving towards being an evidence-based decision-making model, right? So having a sort of single source of truth that is up to the minute, that allows you to make those decisions, and those decisions have to be made faster, you're going to need to have a model like that for your data as well, right? It's sort of the foundation of that strategic HR mindset, I believe. But we all know my love for data here, both of ours.
I know. Wrapping up, I think the only other thing that we didn't get to today was the announcement by Hierology. Actually, I think the conversation we had was, is it an announcement? Hierology announced that they were basically going to have a more in-depth or an extended partnership with Indeed. You want to talk a little bit about that, Cliff?
Yeah, exactly. So The headline being Hierology enhances their partnership with Indeed. So with this integration, any of the jobs created in Hierology are automatically going to be updated in Indeed via an XML feed. So, this just kind of keeps it up to date. But, what was interesting to me is just the further and further integration. Stacey, you had mentioned sort of in the green room beforehand that sort of, okay, because everyone is, kind of getting together with Indeed. I just found it interesting because it wasn't that long ago that I sort of thought of them as competitors. And, we're seeing this further and further moves from other companies too. But as they're further going in, I just wonder if this is an indicator of how much more we're going to see that integration between those two and maybe some others.
Well, and I think, it's important to note that Indeed is definitely, especially for our SMB market, sort of the number one tool being used by the SMBs, which is a very large bucket, right? And I think that's not surprising to anybody. But so I think depending on where your audience is at, you have to have some relationship with the very large sort of job board environment and candidate pool set. But Hierology's got about 4,000 customers, give or take, based off of what we're seeing online. I haven't got a good up briefing with them recently, so that's not from them directly. But what I was interested in is they've done a lot of acquisitions over the last couple of years quietly that people may not be following. They did an employee referral platform that they acquired. They did another sort of customer-based sort of Hierels, which is another company that was the referral-based company that they had acquired. But there was another company they had acquired to just sort of focus on more data across their organization. And so we're just seeing, I think, them sort of expanding what they're offering, which to me is of note because we are seeing the recruiting space sort of the players are starting to say, here's my land, and starting to kind of mark some of the areas that I think that they're going to own. And we're seeing them become bigger and bigger, where a lot of these guys were very small for a long time. And so I just think we're going to hear a lot more about either consolidation and or expansion and partnerships, right?
Agreed.
Well, as we're wrapping up today, I know we're just out of time, so I apologize, guys. We're going to have to jump right into our wrap-ups today. But it was really, really good to get a chance to talk about everything with you, Cliff. I'm looking forward to doing our update after you get back from Meeting of the Minds in the next week, and I get back from the Workday Innovation Summit. We'll have more updates on both the topics we talked about today, right?
Absolutely. Can't wait to continue this conversation as we've been mentioning.
Yep. So quick reminder for our listeners, you can access the key findings and the full annual HR system report that we talked about here a little bit earlier today off of our website. So join us at sapient.com. If you're interested in getting more in-depth data or support in your HR strategy journey, just drop us a line at info@sapientinsights.com to schedule some time to chat. Please sign up for our newsletter to get ongoing updates on research launches, where we'll be speaking or visiting, and when you can participate in our big annual survey, May 9th. Hold the date, please. And thank you to Cliff for helping me pull this together as he does each week. Also, thank you to our production team, Brand Method Media Group, who helps us produce our podcast and run by their amazing founder, Kelly, and our marketing team, who make sure me and Cliff stay on track and get this out to all of the people who are listening to us each week, Lisa Renko and Zoe Britton. And thanks to you, the listeners. We couldn't do this without you as a community. You are the most important thing when it comes to these kind of podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like and save this and download and support the podcast by subscribing and leaving a rating. Sorry, I'm tripping over my words tonight. To stay up to date with immediate breaking HR tech news and getting all the behind the scenes content, you can follow me on LinkedIn at Stacey Harris, as well as Cliff. So look him up as well, because he'll be putting notes out as well in the upcoming weeks, and Twitter at Stacey Harris HR, as well as Sapient Insights HR as well. So looking forward to talking with everybody in the future, and we'll see you back in just 2 weeks with another pot of HR tech updates and insights.